the analogy like I always draw when someone in any stream, when there's awareness without someone having expertise, it's sort of like how when you Google your own symptoms when you're sick, and then you reach this
Yeah.
conclusion that, oh my God, I'm gonna die on Thursday.
This you're talking to, it feels like deja vu.
Let's get started. So, first of all, Ajay and Sujit, it's really cool that the two of you know each other. I think you guys go a long way back at Microsoft as well, right?
That's right.
Nice. So that's actually one of the reasons why we want the two of you on the podcast. We've always seen like if the two of you know each other, kind of that riffing works really well. And I think the topic of the podcast today was going to be more around like framework for doing enterprise sales. And imagine you have a startup founder, an entrepreneur who's trying to sell. I mean, especially today, like we've gotten uh, location agnostic. People are trying to sell from India globally. And the two of you, I was looking at your LinkedIn, it says 20 years of experience. I feel like a lot of the Gen Zs are hovering in that age today.
Mhm.
So I think before we get started, I'd love to learn from the two of you. How has sales changed the last 20 years in terms of medium, in terms of attitudes, in terms of travel? How's it been for the two of you?
So, well, I think many things have changed, but some of the stuff still remains the same. I think the fundamentals are pretty much consistent, as in, the skills that you need to bring to the table, the approach that you need to take. I think all of those are fairly consistent, time tested techniques. I think what has changed is attitudes of the buyers. Um, the buying approach has changed to a large extent. Um, the options that customers have, alternatives, all of those,
Right.
I think, are some of the things that have fundamentally changed, right? So uh, if you take an instance, let's say 20 years ago, um, there were few products in the market which could do certain things, right? It's not like there were too many alternatives. Innovation was not at the clip that it is at today. You didn't have this flurry of startups trying to solve problems. So, in that sense, it was a little more um, defined. Today, I think the markets are highly, you know, uh, undefined, so to speak.
Right. Ajay, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So in a lot of ways, the core basics still remain the same, right? I just think that there's a bunch of buyers who are a lot more aware than
Mm.
than a lot of people were previously, right? So, but the core ethos and the core reason for somebody to be successful continues to be pretty much the same, right? You need to be able to understand what the customer wants, what problem he's trying to solve for. And we can keep talking about a whole bunch of things around innovation and stuff like that. The fact is that end of the day, if I'm not solving for that customer's problem, I'm never going to sell.
Right.
And if I don't understand what that customer is really trying to solve for, then I'm never ever going to sell, right? I can be the biggest brand, I can be the who's who, but I'll never be able to make that deal happen. So you've got to, so while you understand the problem that the customer is able to sell, can you articulate the economic value proposition of that, and why that makes so much of business sense for them to actually make that economic investment, right? And unless you're able to justify that economic investment, the sale will always be a challenge, right? So in that sense, those basics, those nuances still continue to rule the roost. Um, the 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 piece is that buyers are a lot more informed. There are multiple different people who are attacking that same problem through different lens. So that's probably the number of options, like Sudhit was alluding to, have probably gone up. But as a seller, you've got to really keep the buyer at the center of it, and be able to understand problem they're trying to solve for, and what's the economic value proposition that you bring to the table, which solves the business problem in the best possible manner economically, right?
Right.
So that continues to
Hmm.
be the edifice of what makes things stick. So like the more things change, the more they remain the same. So yeah.
Yeah. I think you both touched upon how awareness in the market is generally increased, right? And this is probably through competition, through just more media in each vertical. But does that sort of influence your strategy and how you approach sales? Is it less about education now and more about making the business case, like you touched upon, Ajay, or is kind of your sales strategy, the core principles still remain the same?
And it's interesting, right? I think awareness is a double-edged sword, right? Because
Mm,
I can internalize something the way I see it fit, right?
mm,
And it might not, or might be, or might not be the best way for me to think about it, right? So in that sense, I think it's always critical as a seller to first go establish, irrespective of whether somebody is aware of it, they've got a point of view on it, right? Because sometimes the frame of reference or how somebody needs to think about it is very, very critical for you to actually start your engagement metric, right?
mm,
And then you build off of it, right? So it's very critical that you actually establish uh, how people should view what you're doing, and what's the and how do you attack a problem, right? Or who
mm.
you are, right? So if you set that context well, right? And people, and let me try and see if I can embellish it with some examples, right? So a lot of times, people think of and I'll use some time of mine at Microsoft, right? So for the longest time, everybody used to talk about Office as a productivity tool, and then one
Right.
fine day, Microsoft came and said, um, can we talk about Office as a way to actually say, and it went to the finance people and they said, Office is a way to actually reduce uh, your complexity around managing SAP, right? So use Office as a smart client to actually run SAP at the back end,
Mm,
right? And
Interesting.
what that did was it completely changed people's optics on how they thought about Office or Excel, because everybody's familiar with Excel, but now you said, what, I'll pull in SAP outputs into Excel and be able to run it off Excel. So I don't really need to learn the skill of being able to navigate through the interface that SAP
SAP is
has,
provided. Right.
right? And so that the moment that context switched,
Mm,
right, people started looking at it, and then Microsoft came up with an even more interesting play. They said, what, then you can license it very differently,
Right.
and they layered the economic value proposition on top of it, right? So it
mm.
just that context switching just completely changed how people started thinking and viewing that opportunity.
Right. Such a good point.
Does, yeah, does that give you a little bit more sense of, yeah.
100%, 100%. And I think the analogy, like I always draw, when someone in any stream, when there's awareness without someone having expertise, it's sort of like how when you Google your own symptoms when you're sick, and then you reach this
Yeah.
conclusion that, oh my God, I'm gonna die on Thursday.
Yeah. This you're talking to, it feels like deja vu.
Nice. Sujit, any insight around that as well for you?
Yeah, so um, strategies and all of that obviously um, is very dependent on what you're trying to do and where you want to go with it, right? But I think because of the current situation where awareness is so high, and buyers are way more, let's say, informed, right? Now, whether they're well informed or badly informed, that
Mm,
remains to be seen, but they're certainly well informed, right?
right.
Um, I think what that then puts the um, focus on is that your situational awareness when you're trying to sell needs to be at an all-time high. Because if you're not able to recognize the situation that you're walking into when you're trying to position yourself, services, product, whatever it is, and you don't read it right, then you're going to be going down the path which is wrong for a long time before you realize it, right? So,
Mm.
you know, and that's because of the scale of information and awareness that's out there. So sometimes maybe your customer is correlating the wrong solution for themselves based on the research they did, which means you can't get, um, you know, tempted to go down that rabbit hole. You need to change the narrative, but for which you need to know that the customer is originally in the wrong narrative. On the other hand, it could be the reverse, right? Where you're thinking that this is what's going to solve the problem for the client, or but then it's just not where the client's head is at. So I think in that sense, um, you got to stop and assess the situation, and your situational awareness needs to be able to be really really high, so that you know how to navigate uh, that situation. So it's a quality that you'll need to really look for, and you need to build those things into your strategy. You need to build that into your plan, saying that we got to avoid the pitfalls. We've got to be able to really bring clarity to the client, and sometimes that becomes a huge opportunity, because if you're just simplifying stuff for the client, you it might end up being an advantage to you in the long.
Right. But tell me this is for both of you actually. So you've been selling for E&Y, Ajay obviously is selling for Adobe, and then both of you are Microsoft. I feel like these are like household brands. I mean, if I went in and said, listen, here's a Microsoft product, you need it. I mean, I feel like it's a no-brainer, right? Like, how do you, you're
So,
already in a place where you're getting massive inbound, and
all
it's,
right.
right? So how do you, is the same, or am I just in a different field where
So,
it's difficult?
no, you're right and wrong. It's because in my early days at Microsoft, when we were trying to sell enterprise solutions and products to customers, it was really hard. Clients
Yeah.
wouldn't listen to us. They said, "Hey, listen, you guys are a desktop company. You're selling operating systems. I'm not going to talk to you guys about enterprise." And that's
Mm.
very different from what you're saying, right? Yes, they knew
Mm,
Microsoft as a brand, but what we were trying to sell is not what the client wanted. And we wouldn't even get a chance to, tell our story fully. And in those kind of situations, you got to really bring in everything else that's going, right? You got to build the right relationships. You got to, keep an eye out for the right time to position yourself and all of those stuff. So I think, that's always there. I don't think today a buyer would just buy anything because it's the de facto or
right.
because
Mm.
it's available or accessible. I think those days are long, long gone, right? Um, so in that sense, it still exists. Strong brand names help, but I can tell you it also has a flip side, because when you go in with a strong brand name, there's very little margin for error. Expectations are extremely high from the customer.
Mm,
They come with a lot of preconceived notions about what it might be.
Mm.
Think they're always paying more for something, etc., etc. So there are
that's true.
pros and cons for both, which is why you got to figure out how you want to, position it and leverage your strengths and kind of watch out for the weaknesses.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples from whether it's today or early days where, as you were saying, right, like, oh, they saw you as a desktop company and then you're trying to sell, let's say, something else. What was, how do you go about, let's say, making that pitch, or as a team, right? How did you kind of shift their perspective? Um, yeah, I would love to hear.
So it's a bit of a medium to a long game. It's not something that happens in a short time, right? So, and that's why typically um, a lot of companies need to invest in their bigger customers or their most strategic customers if they can qualify them, right? Because what happens is you put in that slightly mid and long term effort with a strategic customer of yours, and once that happens, then you take that out and talk to 10 other customers who don't need that
Mm.
level of convincing, because you managed to make it work for someone else.
Yep.
So that's why this whole concept of building referenceability and getting your initial customers who can vouch for you is so important, right? So that process and that technique still applies, and you need to be able to use it very effectively. um, but for you to be able to put yourself in that position, one is you got to really um, put your ears to the ground. You have to know when is the opening that's coming up for you to be able to step in. You need to know what's going on with your compete. You need to know what's going on in the account. So if they're not buying from you, who else are they buying from? If they're not buying from you for 5 reasons, you know, are they able to get those things from somebody else, or is that just three and two are still open? So then you position
Yeah.
yourself for those two and work your way up, right? So it needs a lot of um, understanding of your client's situation. And a lot of people tend to not find out more about things that are working. But I think it's very essential for you to really, really know why something is working in an account, whether it's, that you've given or somebody else given. Everybody tends to see what's missing, right? So I think it's a combination of all of these things, and then you need timing and luck as always. I think that is very, very essential. Um, And then I think then the another big aspect which always kicks in is the stakeholder mapping, right? I think a lot of people uh, don't realize that the the whole selling and buying process involves not just the immediate buyer or the person sitting in front of you or the decision. There are influencers, there are early influencers, there are post sale beneficiaries. There's a whole ecosystem, and you got the more you understand about that ecosystem, and the more you understand about the players, both active and passive players.
Mm.
I think that you put yourself in a better position to have a stronger value proposition for the client.
Right. So actually, both Sujit and Ajay, why don't we take an example, right? Where let's say I'm a startup, I'm going to start doing enterprise sales in India. And I've heard so much about enterprise sales in India just being
Yeah.
not the easiest, right? And you talked about stakeholder mapping. Let's say there's a product that I'm to sell that's expensive, right? Let's say it's $150,000, $200,000 per year kind of product. How would I go about it? I mean, yeah, let's say I know nothing about, I know something about the industry. I've achieved kind of product market fit, let's say with a pilot in some sense, but yeah, how would I get started?
All right, let me take a shot at this. So typically what happens when you start a new company or you're a startup, your initial immediate network are your investors or people who have helped you set that up, etc. Right? So typically your initial few clients would probably be people that you got introduced to in that network or through that network, where it's a less um let's say complex buying cycle, right? So let's say you have an investor, he's putting money into different companies, they introduce each other saying that, hey, here's potential. The two founders or the two um, uh, organizations speak to each other. The business buyer says, yeah, great, let's do this. Maybe cost of entry is lower, whatever may be the case, and they end up completing the sale, right? I think what everybody needs to realize and why the term enterprise sales even exists is that when you get to larger organizations, there is a buying process. There is a cycle that needs to be followed, right? There is a procurement organization that comes in, which may not be there in a lot of your initial clients, right?
Right.
Mm.
Unless you have started selling to the bigger ones, right? But there is a procurement team, and their goal is to reduce, cost as much as possible, right? So while the sales guy, every sales guy is, uh, typically incentivized on selling and increasing the sale, the procurement person, it's the
Yeah.
right opposite, right? The more they save, the better it is for them. So so you got to get used to the fact that there is this team that wants to do the exact opposite what you are trying to do, other than the fact that they need to get something for themselves, right? Um, and then when that happens, the psyche changes, right? A lot of people make the biggest mistake of thinking that they can only sell to the business, right? So you've sold to the business, value is done. Business guy says, great, they've given their best price to them, floor price, all of that done. Then the business guy says, hey, by the way, you need to talk to the procurement guys to make this deal happen. But what they don't realize is when you go to the procurement guy, that's when the process is actually starting. And that
Mm.
guy's going to say, great, you give this price. Now let's go from there, right? And then
Mm.
you've not factored all of that, whether it's a commercial aspect of it, whether it's any other, benefits you want to give, etc., right? Um, and business value is going to fall into deaf ears because by design, it is, but they are registering it, right? It's
Right.
just that it's not conducive for them to be using that as something that they will see value in, because the psyche is completely different. So I think
Mhm.
this, and then it need not end there, right? It could be a different process. They could, if it's a larger buy or larger budget, then there's a bigger ecosystem of stakeholders that needs to approve it, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. So I think not understanding this and suddenly wanting to shift gears from having sold to people that were introduced through the network or didn't have a defined buying process to going and trying to sell to an organization where, I've had like a procurement person tell me, listen, I'm okay. I don't need this for the next 1 year. I have the
Mm.
business person telling me he needs it tomorrow or
Right.
yesterday. The procurement guy is like, I'm good. I'll buy it next year. So, if, in large organizations, there are alternatives. There are ways that, sales can be accelerated or decelerated.
Mm.
I think the understanding of that is what is important. And it will be like that. And the larger organization it is, the more, um, complex the buying process could be, not necessarily, right? But you have to know what that is.
No, I think that's very well articulated, Sujit, and I can't agree more, because this whole counterpoints of view, right, is really
Mm.
at play, and this is that is the essence and ethos of enterprise sales, right? That you've got this buyer who's sitting on the other side, whose only job is to bring down cost, and you as a seller want to do the deal at the best possible price possible, right? And that balance and the discovery of the balance is where the game is, right? Everybody keeps saying enterprise sales in India is hard. Enterprise sales worldwide is hard.
Right.
There is nothing which says that enterprise sales is going to be easier elsewhere, right? People keep saying, in America it's probably, obviously the budgets are probably larger, etc., right? But the value and the equation around value will completely depend. I mean, I remember, early on in my career and in Sujit's career, when we used to talk productivity, right? The way productivity was pegged at by an American company was very different from the way productivity is pegged at by Indian companies, right?
Mm.
If you can very quickly orient yourself to what productivity means and what cost of an employee is, and have a frame of reference from there, right? Then you can go from it from a very realistic standpoint, right? Aside of that, I think all else remains the same, because at the end of the day, everybody's seeking greater value, right? So you've got to be able to do that. The other thing that I think I keep remembering, from what this is something that Steve Ballmer used to say. He used to always keep saying, Microsoft as a company is long term and hardcore, and I can't think of and I can't think of anything in that's more crucial to being successful at sales than these two things, right?
Mm.
You've got to be long term and you've got to be hardcore, right? Because what will typically end up happening is that you will end up hitting roadblocks, because you might have been blinded to the fact that there is an influencer that's coming at it from some other angle, right?
Mm.
And there are multiple different plays that you're probably not seeing, and so you've got to be willing to make a long term commitment, and you got to keep coming back at it, right? And that, a lot of people mistake a long sales cycle for it being a hard sales cycle. But the fact is, sales cycles are hard. Sales is tough. Sales takes you to do a bunch of things, and there are times when it's like saying, if you play a sport, right, and you play basketball or TT, right? There are days when you're playing against the toughest opponent, but when everything falls in place, right, it seems so smooth and easy. But the same thing can be really hard when it's not, when there are multiple things that you haven't seen that are coming and hitting you, right?
Hmm.
So, and that's pretty much what ends up happening with sales also. I mean, it's just multiple different pieces that have to fall together for it to look very, very easy. So I mean, but it's hard across the globe, and it's something that requires very long term dedicated effort for you to continue to do that and continue to get better at it. I can't think of an enterprise seller who will tell you that, I think I've cracked it,
Right.
that I can win everybody goes in to every deal as it's day one, right? Or it's the first deal that you're doing. Because even if and even if you've done a deal with that same customer before, doesn't mean that you can take it for granted.
Two of you have any examples of a deal that lasted, let's say it took 6 months or 9 months, or even like, let's say a couple of years?
I
But
I would have guessed 6 or 9 is quite common, no, in the kind of products you guys sell.
Yeah. So by design, a lot of the annual contracts that we used to work with the clients had a 12-month run up. In some cases, a 3-year run up, right? Because that's the time frame for which the contract allowed you to,
Right.
determine usage and mix of products, etc. So, and that completely depends on what your product is and what you're trying to sell, right? But I think for any salesperson, when they get in, they should realize that this is not a one-hit wonder. It's not something that you can sell and leave and go. You have to go in with the mindset saying that you want to be standing in front of this client 1 year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, whether you're in that company or they're in that company or not. But if you don't have the long-term mindset, it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think this is maybe a segue into, what are some of the qualities that, sales people should have. And, just alluding to Ajay's point earlier on the sales cycle, I think a lot of salespeople tend to get in front of the client thinking they're well prepared, they're super trained, etc. But they don't realize that the person sitting across them is also equally trained or better trained in their profile and their job, right? Procurement folks, for example, go through negotiation training. They go through, value training, understanding value, etc. They may pretend that they don't get it, but trust me, they do, right? I've sold to technology buyers who are more proficient in technology than the people for whom they were buying that technology, right? So I think, salespeople also sometimes tend to get cocky when they're good at their jobs. And that is a big, big pitfall that they got to watch out for. You'll have a lot of successful years, but, it's always constantly changing. And unless you're someone who's reinventing yourself, you're going to be in trouble someday or the other.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's so true, because, what got you there won't get you, won't keep you there. And the fact that you've always got to be, just go back, drop your ego, pick up that bag and be willing to listen, because unless you're listening, right? And like Sujit's saying, right, a lot of the guys and procurement guys and a lot of the guys who are buying, right, can really either downplay, upplay, and you'll see all sorts of characters, right? And you've got to be able to deal with all of them, right? So some of them will downplay their own skills. Some of them will put you down. But I mean, and everybody's got a different strategy, right? So you've got to be able to work through all of that and be able to come up with what are the different alternatives. How do you approach it? How do you actually skin it and solve it, right? So they and which means that this is something that necessitates you to have an open mind, have a willingness to listen to what the other guy is saying, understand the subtext of what he's saying, and be able to pick that up and solve from there on.
Yeah, that's actually such a good point, right? Because your first instinct can be like, let's say he says, okay, I'm going to pay only 10%, or I'm not ready. Your first instinct can be very irrational, or like mutter a few words when he's not seeing, right? But how do you deal with such examples where, I mean, Ajay, sorry, I'll let you chime in.
No, go ahead. I think it's kind of simple.
But like, for example, and for both Sujit and Ajay, let's say, the business guy says, listen, I love your product. I think we should move this forward. And then they connect you to this procurement person via email. And then he responds via email and says, listen, I don't think I need this for the next year, right? Like, how do you combat that conversation and then flip it into a win? I think I'm curious about that.
So I think first you gotta be able to recognize the fact that it means that the buying process has started. A lot of people think it's the end of the
That's the most
process.
optimistic way of looking at
And
it.
and by the way,
Right.
if you're not an optimistic person and if you're
Right.
not a people person, please don't be in sales.
Fair.
The wrong job. So I think that for me, it's a great sign when somebody says, you know, I want it at this price, or this is not going to work, because I know that that means they're interested, and it's the beginning of the dance, so to speak, right? Um, and then I think one is to not be perturbed. You got to be ready, saying that okay, this is it. Not kind of have your world around you crumble and say, oh God, I've given everything away, I have nothing left, right? So you got to be able to receive that news and say, okay, now the game is on. And then I think you got to really get down to figuring out, where are they coming from? If somebody's asking for a ridiculous price, then you got to really kind of demystify that to say, why is that? Is it because they don't understand the value of the proposition? Is it because they have an alternative which they think is better? Because you have different strategies for different things, right? If it's an alternative, then you got to figure out if it is a viable alternative, or are they kind of going down the wrong path, like I mentioned earlier, right? So you got to really get down to what's behind the psyche of that ask. I find that a lot of people just kind of start going into this defensive mode, or going into this mode saying, I'm going to hold my price, I don't care. And that is so unproductive. Go find out, right? I've actually asked a customer when they said, they wanted to pay me something really ridiculous. I said, why are you asking me for that? Why aren't you just asking me for the product free of cost? And then I got the answer saying, if I get it free of cost, I can't hold you accountable for it. Therefore, I need a value for it. Right? So you see, it also showed me that, which means it's more of a negotiation static where they want to start at the base and see where you are at, right? So, and I think it's very important. In many ways, it's also, kind of putting the stake on the ground for one end of the spectrum, and then you got to see where you can put the stake at the other end, and you're going to figure out that you're going to meet somewhere where it works for both. And believe me, no deal works no deal successfully works and stays working unless you can get to a stage where you're happy with what you got and your buyer's happy with what they bought. Right? Now, they may not express it necessarily in that sense, but when that happens, that's when you've got a long-term relationship or a long-term game on for each other.
Great. Ajay, I think you had a question.
Yeah. So I think Ajay had touched upon this earlier when he said every sale is like a day one thing and everything is new. And then Sujit, I think you were talking about there being a lot of different characters and different like profiles. After all these years of being in sales, are there like templates of people or situations which you can draw upon and say that, okay, this is this kind of person, this kind of company, this is the approach to go best. This is the best approach to go with, or is it more like I will go and feel it out and then sort of draw from my years of experience and then move forward?
Well, actually, it's the other way around, right? It depends on who you're trying to sell to, and they could be organized in different ways. But you got to be able to train yourself and have the wherewithal to understand how to recognize the scenario in which your customer is. And for that, there are certain things, right? So I think discovery, being good at discovery, being able to ask the right questions without kind of, making the customer wary of giving you answers to it is very, very key to understanding it. Because the process varies in various companies. The sequence of who comes in when and who buys and how varies. So it's really important to understand that. Like, we have had situations where we thought everything is done, dusted. We've been through all the negotiation cycles, etc. There was a change in the leadership, new CFO, and deal didn't happen, right? And this was a player who was not otherwise in the scheme of things, given everything. So the variables are always high, and you should assume that there can be changes at any time. So there's not real template as such, but there is an approach to how you profile a company. and understanding how that company is set up, and what could be the typical process for it. Now there are some very fundamental basics, right? The bigger the company is, for example, in IT, then they typically tend to have a vendor empanelment process or a preferred vendor list or preferred partner list. So you got to make sure that you're part of that. If you're not, then it's a
Right.
different story. Then you got to have somebody who has discretionary budgets, etc. You need to understand how their budgeting cycles work, how are budgets allocated, etc. So those are certain fundamentals that exist. Like there are companies even today that I know I'm not able to sell because I'm not on their global uh, empaneled list. That could be like in a 3-year window or a 5-year window where they go through the process to do that. And you got to make sure you're catching it. If you're not, there's nothing you can do about it, right? So I think from in that sense, there is no set template to what your clients could be set up as, but there are approaches that you can take to understand that.
So, and I can't agree more, right? I think just to add, what I think is templates um, are often used as crutches by a lot of us, right? Saying, how can I simplify this, and is there a template to it?
Correct.
And like I was saying, a lot of the sales is really just something that you got to be long term about, right? Which means that you're always at ground zero. It's always like you're starting from new, and there are zero templates, right? I mean, just a lot of times in tech we believe that if I've had a shake hand with the business owner, and I started up, and the business owner, another business owner that I met, he liked what we were trying to do. We shook hands, procurement came in, and they completely changed the dynamic, right? And that continues, and that will continue to happen. It could be procurement, it could be finance, it could be HR. I mean, depending on what you're trying to do, etc., right? Now, the fact is that you can and your so, and a lot of times, a lot of us react to these kind of situations, right? Because especially when you're a startup founder, you're starting up, you just think that the world is running off your shoulders, right?
Right.
And you're perpetually under this massive pressure, right? So you're trying to make everything work, and everything that doesn't seem like how it should go in your head seems like it's the end of the world, right? So you start creating these crazy amounts of pressure on yourself to actually be able to land deals, right? So what that does is it actually starts to make things a lot more complex than they are. But having said that, the core fundamental principles, right? Whether you are uh, selling to enterprises in India, abroad, will still remain the same, right? You've got to go approach, understand, find the buyer, understand what their buying process is. Do a discovery, and discovery, like Sujit was mentioning, right, is critical. And as you keep getting introduced to new personas, how do you keep discovering? How do you keep learning more about the organization? Because the thing with the larger organizations, right, is that it's like a multi-headed hydra, if you may, right? So it's got and there's a point of view for every single department, right?
Right.
And you've got to be able to discover that for every department that you interact with, right? So there is never a one size that'll fit all, and you've got to be willing to put the hard yards to actually be able to do that discovery all over, right? And that's what makes it complex, and that's what makes it fun.
Give us an example of what discovery would look like. I mean, do you get the opportunity to get in front of them and then like, okay, I spoke to the, let's say the product team, and like, okay, you know what, my next meeting is set up, let's say with the finance team. Like, you have to have the opportunity to do discovery, right? Or is it, hey, I can do a lot of this preemptive even before I meet them by talking to, let's say, someone from your network, or let's say even like, let's say doing some form of research online.
There's a lot of things that you can do. There's a lot of techniques, right, that you can employ to make sure that the discovery process. One is, of course, you can show up a little earlier, and if somebody around has time, then you kind of ask them a little more about the organization. One of the things that I do is, and that's the reason I'd like to go to customers' offices, um, uh, which is a big advantage of doing things in person, because you have the opportunity to maybe get introduced to somebody else or ask about somebody else next door, and hey, that's an interesting looking cabin. Who sits there? And then you find out, what they do, etc. And then you can maybe make a request to get introduced or whatever, right? The point being that if you're going to be as a salesperson, you got to have your antennas up all the time. You got to be looking at your environment. You got to know, hey, uh, you know, and keep asking questions, creating the environment for yourself, or creating the opportunities for yourself to meet more people or to get more information about something. And a lot of this comes about how you go about asking it. I mean, I've also had customers when I ask that respond saying, why are you asking me this? I'm not going to tell you, right? So,
We
never
had
mind.
that recently with someone from Bounce, actually.
Yeah.
We were trying to sell.
So then obviously
Yes.
the next time you're gonna rephrase your question, maybe ask it in a different way, right?
Yeah.
And that's why research is always important. Never go in blind, right? Even if I'm meeting somebody for 5 minutes or 10 minutes somewhere, I'll try and see what I can get some context. And and typically if you're from Bangalore, there will be like 3 degrees of separation somewhere,
Yeah.
somehow. And that really helps, right? Maybe it's 4 or 5 somewhere else, right? So I think these are things that you got to create for yourself, opportunity to create, and that is a big part of the discovery process. I think a lot of times, because we're going in so focused on what that meeting agenda is, which of course you need to be for the meeting timing, but you gotta train yourself to say, hey, listen, I gotta be thinking all the time, even not just about the meeting agenda, but stuff that's coming off it before and after and everybody else, right?
Yeah. And to Sujit's point, right? Never confuse preparedness with discovery, right? I mean, you can prepare all you want, right? And there is nothing that beats preparation, right? But don't ever confuse it with discovery, right? Because a lot of times you'll I mean, and you start to see the trend, right? That you will start. I mean, if you're doing this by yourself, right? Then you will start discovering things while in your preparation, which sound like a slam dunk to you, because you've got a hammer and you see a nail, and you know what the hammer's going to do, right? So that's a given. So that's why what you need to do is you need to be able to separate the difference between being prepared to discovering. You discover with the customer, you always prepare by yourself, right? And that's essential. So you do that, and then you get in there and ask, uh, and in a lot of ways, right? It's you always have to seek for permission to ask, right? And a lot of times we just think that because I'm sitting across the table from you, I have every right to ask you a question, right? And a lot of times we end up pissing people off by the way we ask, right? Because somewhere we always it just moves back in the recesses of our head, that the permission is a permission to ask the question again and again. And you've got to set up that context to ensure that permission's given and granted, right? And not taken for granted at all.
Yeah.
So again, uh, the more grounded and the more humble you are, I think that um, will continue to be able to define for you and how good a listener you are, right? A lot of times people think that a sales guy is somebody who speaks a lot,
Right.
right? And I keep hearing this thing, right? Like, he's a snake oil salesman. He can sell a igloo to a refrigerator to an escape. I'm like, who does that stuff, right? And what sort of an example is that? Because end of the day, I mean, and 20 plus years in sales, and I've never seen good salespeople be you know dramatically garrulous, right? They speak, but they, I mean, they're fun-loving folks, but I don't think they're talking 19 to a dozen. They're not they and there are no types to it, right? So there might be some guy who would like to hold an audience, and there'd be some guy who'd like to be reserved and an introvert, but still a very successful salesperson. And I just think that this whole typecast template, this whole trying to put everybody into a box, is starts to make things very, very difficult.
What is your style though? And Sujit, for you as well. I feel like, I mean, Ajay, I've got my ass kicked by you while playing TD a bunch of times. But what's your? I brought that up because I feel like it's a very conversation with you. But yeah, what are both of your styles when you're selling, if there's any?
I think I'm me, right? I do me essentially. So the person that I am is what I bring through, and I think the one thing that I've noticed all buyers or people that you interact with across, what they look for is authenticity, right? Now you could be whatever brand of that authenticity, but if you're trying to be somebody you're not, if you're trying to do something that doesn't come through as authentic, it's gonna catch up, right? So you can be a seller who's not too technical, but as long as you're not portraying otherwise, it's fine. You could be somebody who's super technical, etc., and then so essentially you need the person across the team, across the table to respect you, right? And to recognize you for your authenticity. I think that goes a long, long way. And when Ajay was talking about um, the stereotyping and everything else, uh, snake oil sales. It reminds me of a funny incident that I had. I was actually at a customer meeting with one of my colleagues who was from the US at that time, and I was managing a global client for them in India, and he was the one managing them in the US, and we came. And he came down to India, and we went to meet the client. We also had our like we were it was like two in a box, right? We would have a salesperson and a technology specialist together um, to manage the client, and he had his technology specialist with him, and so did I. Um, and then we were in that meeting, um, and then one of the technology specialists just took off right on a tangent, trying to bring out how technically sound he was, and the agenda of the meeting was something else. And and we didn't even have a chance, and we could see that the customers completely lost interest. He's waiting for the clock to run down so he can get out of the room. And that's when, this colleague of mine gave me advice. He said, Sujit, always sit in kicking distance of your colleague. Have to kick his foot under the table when you think this is not going where it should, right? And
Right.
I actually followed that. I would always position myself next to the, in kicking distance of the person. So, I mean, it just, of course, we did then have a conversation after that, and kind of convey to that person saying that that's not going to work, and hopefully they picked it up and built it in their style, right? But the thing is, it's just one of these instances where it's a funny piece of advice, but it's also very, very relevant, right? It may not be as drastic as kicking the person under the table, but there has to be some prep before you go, or some
Right.
sign off on who's going to do what and how. And another instance, in fact, is alluding to the earlier thing in terms of the situation. We were a large team. We had three people flying in from different parts of the country. We had this huge deck ready, everybody's role assigned, who's going to speak what, and etc. We show up at the client's place, and the client says, "Sorry guys, I've got only 5 minutes. Something else has come up." And these guys were hard broken, right? Because they'd taken flights, prepared for. And then I said, let's not waste this 5 minutes. So I asked the customer, tell us three things we need to know, which will make sure that you've seen the decks already, right? So it's not like they had to go through three things that's on your priority for the sale to happen. And we actually got that, because I think the customer also felt bad that we've got this whole piece. So maybe he shared with me what he might have otherwise not in a 1 hour meeting with everybody doing their bit, right?
Hmm.
But we could use that information then to make sure that we could, progress the sale in the right direction following. So it's just an example of how the situation could turn out to be something, but you can still make something good out of it, if you think on your feet.
That's actually highly insightful, because when someone's given 5 minutes, you can be like, let me pitch for 5 minutes versus, hey, let me ask you these three
Yeah.
questions, right? I think that's huge. And doesn't seem like you came from a place of scarcity, right? It's like, uh, this is the information I need to make this happen. So I think that's cool.
I think that, to my mind, I think that is something that you'll see the better salespeople do consistently, right? People will start responding rather than reacting, right? And then you'll see the younger lot will be more reaction prone, right? You've flown from all over the globe and you've been told it's only 5 minutes, right? Typically your reaction is, what nonsense. I mean, this is heights, right?
Right.
But the more you learn to calm yourself down and say, okay, so this is where we are at, and how do I respond to it so that I can make maximum out of it, right? And I think that journey of being able to convert your initial impulsive reaction to a measured response, right? I think that separates an average seller from a good seller, or somebody who can make a career out of sales, right? And you've got to do this consciously, right? I mean, I remember for the largest part of my career, I it's pretty much how I play the game, right? I'm a react kind of a guy, right? But the more you start getting deliberate and the more you start getting purposeful about how you want to respond and how you want to use a situation, right, is when you start creating a scenario where you're in a place which squarely puts you in a place where you can have the best possible outcome for both sides, right? And that I think is learning that you've got to do deliberately, right? So in a lot of ways, right? What I have seen is that I've seen salespeople with bad styles evolve to be really good salespeople who start off really well, show a lot of brightness and spark, just fritter away because somewhere they lose that willingness to continue to listen and keep sharpening themselves, because in sales, end of the day, you've got to continuously keep evolving yourself, right? And that's a commitment that you got to make to yourself, to your trade, to ensure that because there is if you're not doing this for yourself, you will very quickly become irrelevant. And that, I think, is that's it's the most in your face in sales, right? In if you're in any other job, right, if you're in tech, etc., you will have to wait for your manager to tell you. Here, 3 or 4 meetings out in the customer, you'll very quickly know, dude, you're not getting it. You're not in the game. This is not the game that you were playing, right? It's like any sport, right? You're playing the sport, you will very quickly know whether you get it or not. You're not sharpening yourself. You're not,
Right.
and that's and I keep telling people, right? I said, sales is it is something where every day, right, it's action oriented, and it's a profession which is rewarded for outcome, right? So you've got to be very clearly attuned to the fact that you've got to create action, and you've got to be willing to ensure that you do whatever it takes to get the outcome that you desire, right? So you've got to, and so in that sense, it's like, if you're getting on the field to play, and if you're not winning, right, there is nothing. And it's brutal that way, right? So the
Right.
reaction's there upfront in your face, and you see it, and you can see it coming at you every day. So unless you're committed to getting better at it, it just becomes very, very hard to keep at this game.
think I'm going to share some wisdom that was
Yeah, I
passed on
feel the
by one of my managers very early in my career, right, of sales. He told me, your job is not to sell to the client. Your job is to make it easier for them to buy from you, right? And if,
mm,
if you imbibe that into what you're doing in every action that is, which is, I'm not there to sell, I want to make it easy for them to buy from me, right? I think it really kind of tips the scale in terms of how you'll approach things and how things play out for you as well.
it's a
Yeah.
great point. I've always felt sales is quite binary in that sense, where it's a win or lose game. It's a zero sum game. The sale either happens or it doesn't. So, especially for someone early in their career in sales, and I know Ajay, you mentioned the long sales cycles as well, so that can get tiring also. How do you, I guess, stay motivated? What are the wins you look for? How do you take positive out of things that don't happen, and how do you just evolve in that industry?
So, I mean, and to me, initially in your career, there's nothing that's zero, that's binary. It's a
right?
performance sport. It's a performance profession, and you've got to give yourself time initially to actually learn the profession before you can start performing, right?
Mm,
And I remember when I started my career, I remember I had a manager who told me, in for the next 6 months, I don't want to see you in office after 10 o'clock in the morning and before 6 o'clock in the evening. Right? And I'm like, so what do I do? He says, go out, go to every building, start from the top and come finish right at the bottom, right? So you've got to do this cold calling, right? A lot of people do it, a lot of people don't do it, and
mm,
there are pluses and minuses of doing it, right? But the expectation that in those first 6 7 months, right, for you to sell is putting unnecessary pressure on yourself, right? It's like saying, you play a sport to a reasonable extent, and then you want to win championship. It's never going to happen, right? It's
mm,
you've got to pace yourself into it, right? So you've got to understand you've got to start putting in the yards. It's like preparing for a marathon. You've got to do those things that are actually get you ready for doing it, right? so
mm,
so 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 your first thing is to understand the nuances, learn through it. you know uh, when you're doing this cold calling, right, of going and seeing these different companies, finding out. So the first time that you'll go there, you'll ask the receptionist for the card. The next time you'll say, oh, so this is the card, so what does the company do? So then you're
mm,
learning something, and then the third thing, the third time that you do there, you're like, so this is what the company does. Who in this company does this, right? So every single time you go out there, right, you will keep enhancing the questions that you ask, right? And
mm,
you'll keep getting better, and slowly, at some point, you will be able to get through a receptionist by just being able to do some bit of the prep work prior, and getting in there and having a much richer conversation to actually break through, right? So the point is, how do you do this, and not be dramatically hard on yourself initially, right? At least
mm,
so you got to stay with this thing that this is going to be a little bit tough, but you've got to be long term and hardcore about it, right? So again, I'll go back to those
nice.
two fundamental pieces, right? And just once you're in it, right, then you're continuously looking at what are the different pieces that are evolving as you go forward, right? And you'll continuously see that a lot of the a lot of sales, right, will happen in conversation, and as you keep discovering. So
Mm,
and you'll keep getting better at that whole discovery piece, right? uh, the more you have saying, oh, I know this type, right? The more you get into that kind of a mindset, right, saying, I know this type, I know exactly what I should say to this type to overcome this objection, right?
mm,
And I kid you not, that's the first indication that you're on a downslope, right?
Mm.
Because you're going to start sliding down fairly quickly, right? And my submission to everybody is to just not get into this thing of saying, you know what, you don't know any type, right? And there are no two types of people who are
mm.
similar, right? You've got to understand where somebody is coming from, and the more you can understand, and the more you can, listen to respond, right?
Right.
Listen to understand rather to respond, right? Is what's going to really define a good seller from an average or a poor seller. So I think a lot of it is patience. A lot of it is just being willing to put in the hard yards, and just be willing to uh, you know not typecast, and understand the larger purpose, right? You're trying to serve the customer. I for the longest time, I never really thought about, do I serve the customer, right?
Mm.
And is that a good way to think about it? Because what does that do to my relationship, right? So for the longest time, I had this thing in my head that, if I'm serving the customer, does that mean that the customer is
Right.
my boss? And
Yeah.
then you and then when I started up, right, it was a moment of 100% clarity, right? That the only boss that you have is the customer,
Right.
right? And the way he gives you his vote of confidence is by giving you the money,
Mm.
right? And there is nothing that is more real than that. And so you are at any given point in time serving that customer, and you've got to have no misgivings about that, right? and
Mm.
and 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 that and just because you're serving somebody doesn't mean that the relationship's
You don't have
skewed.
to
Fall
you
over
don't have to
yourself
Right.
and stuff like that, right? But you've got to be able to do that to the best of your ability, such that the customer is able to solve for the problem that they're looking to solve for, right? And I think that's the journey, and you've got to continuously keep doing that to the best of your ability. And I think it's there is. I mean, I still haven't met anybody. And I've met a fair bit of very good salespeople, right? Who think that they figured out sales.
Right.
So
Coming to your earlier point, and Ajay, on you asked about losing deals or winning deals, right? I think just like everything else in life, you win some and you lose some.
Right.
Most often than not, the tendency seems to be to dissect the wins and figure out, oh, we did great, etc. But you should give equal attention to why did you lose, right? And what do you learn from that? And that then starts increasing your chances and ability to win more rather than lose more. A lot of
100%.
times we tend to want to forget the losses
Yep.
or not look back, but I
Mm.
think it's very, very essential for a salesperson to figure out why they lost something, and in that there will be always more learning than knowing why they won something. Why you won something is great for someone else, right? When you share your story of this is what happened, somebody else can benefit from that. Your other team members can benefit from that, not you. You learn the most from why you lost something. So I think that's something that you should bake into your psyche and your process.
Well
Good
said.
one.
Well said. Um, Actually, if you don't mind, I want to switch the gears up a little bit into. I mean, this is all great. I feel like we're going to get a lot of these yarn moments that get converted into reels. But I was curious about the team. Right now, let's say you guys are heading a sales team. What does a typical sales team need to look like? Especially when I'm starting off. Let's say we had 3 stages, right? We had your okay, I need to get my first 10, 20 customers versus that next stage of, okay, I'm expanding from a 25 to 100 and then that posted 100, right? How do team structures change? Let's say if you want to touch upon a little bit, how does like sales processes change, if any?
All right. So I think so a lot of it depends on, what's the kind of product or market that you're addressing, what's the kind of organization that you are, right? So right now I represent a services organization, which isn't professional services, and it's a well-known brand. So the way I set up my team is slightly different, right? The clients that we want to go to are typically familiar with us in some shape or form, right? They may be buying a small part from us or a large part from us, but they're not buying many things from us, right? So the approach that I have could be different. I need people who are fairly more mature in their sales experience, because you're going into an environment where um, it's not really cold calling, but you got to build out. So you have this whole concept of hunting and farming, etc. Right? Though I
Mm.
think that you got to hunt at all times, right? It's just that, what is the definition of hunting and farming? Because you can't farm until you hunt something anyways, right? And you constantly, you have to keep hunting. So the thing is, in my kind of a scenario, I need people coming in, um, who need to elevate the level of sales, who need to be able to, change things up and do things differently, and manage to do things in a different way than it's been happening so far. But at the same time, now if you're starting off, and the kind of customers that you're going to, you need people to do a lot of, let's say, profiling work, a lot of you know hit and miss cold calling, etc. Then people typically take the approach of having like an inside sales and a field sales, right? And that's what, Ajay and I, very early in our careers, we had a setup like that, right? Because
Mm.
we would have an inside sales that would kind of tee things up for us, do the basic stuff, tell us that this customer is interested, not interested, etc. And then one of us would end up showing up in front of the client in person, and then we would see if we can take it further from there. um, a lot of times you might have to do both yourself, so it depends on how you want to set it up, what the resources you have, what's your budgets that you have to set up the sales teams, etc. But don't be mistaken at any point in time that the person who's even selling at a mature cycle does not understand or cannot do what's the basics, right? If you think that that is not needed, you're highly mistaken, right? So you should have the ability to
Mm.
do all of it. But how you want to set it up is a function of what's the scale that you want to achieve. Are you a product, or are you an offering that you have, like, you have to land the top 10 customers who buy that? Then it's a very different approach, right? Because then you're assuming that you're selling to a more mature customer, and then you got to plan your sales team or your sales approach accordingly. If you have a product that you want 100 people to consume, then the model that you put in place is different, right? But typically, when you see large product companies, they would have organize their teams into segments or sectors, right? So you would have an SMB sales team, you would have like a mid-market sales team, and you would have an enterprise sales team. And the nature of those teams could be different. The skills that people need in each of those teams could be very different. And the model of how they go to market will be different, of course. So it really depends on, uh, you know, what's your product positioning, and what are your target clients. But as you get bigger, you will have to get organized in this manner.
Mm.
But as a startup, right? I mean, if you're starting out, right? I genuinely would encourage founders to do the initial bit of selling, right? At least the initial few sales. When I say few, I don't mean like 4 5. I mean like 20 30, right?
Mm.
Hold some of the core key relationships, right? Because initially what typically ends up happening is that the Pareto's principle kicks in, right? The top 20% will
Yep.
will contribute 80% of your revenue, right? And usually in the initial few years it'll be one or two clients, right? You've got to hold that relationship. You've got to be able to know exactly what's happening, and that's what you spend your time. That's the client you spend your time on, right?
Mm.
You've got to be willing to do that, right? And as you keep growing the business, right? Your sales organization will keep evolving basis uh, product, basis market, basis strategy, right? So I mean, if I have to look at I typically try and do a framework saying, am I selling a high volume product, right? uh, which means that I need so distribution becomes critical for me, right?
Mm.
Because this fair bit of volume that I want to put out in the market, right? Then I need to think if I have to do that, do I go inside sales? Do I do distribution channel? So then you need to start thinking high volume and start saying, what is it that will get me the volume that I'm looking for, right? Or I say, you know what, I'm doing low volume but high ticket size sales, right? And then I start saying, okay, so if I have to staff accordingly, right, then how do I staff, right? And then you've got to understand that your sales reward mechanisms will be different on both sides of the house, right? Because if you're a high volume distribution kind of a play, right, uh, your sales rewards, right, should be a lot more predictable, because chances of you missing it by a mile should be very minimal, and chances of you hitting the ball out of the park should be equally minimal. But if somebody does, then he or she does it because of just something phenomenal that they've figured out, right? And so then reward them accordingly. But if it's a high ticket size, low volume game, right, then it's a very then it's all about salesmanship. So then reward the seller. So you've got to be willing to look at your sales team and say, you know what, 50% of my sales team not going to meet their quota, right? Because you've got to plan it accordingly. Because what that does is that if it's going to be like every deal is a curated deal, if you may, right? The ability for everybody to hit their number is going to be that much harder for them to be able to do, right? So you will keep evolving your organization basis how you see your product and who you're selling to continuously keep evolving, right? But initially, the founder needs to own it, needs to sell. I was listening to Nitin Kamath the other day, Zero Da, right? And he was like, when they initially started, he says, I would be the inbound call center specialist, right? So he says, I would take these calls and I would talk to these customers, right? And he says during COVID, he says, we did so much of this technology stuff that all our entire the whole onboarding, right? He says because of Aadhaar, etc., it became just so much tech oriented that nobody needed to speak, right? He says, I just moved my entire inbound sales organization to support, right? And he says, I've done away with my sales organization, right? And so again, it depends on the product that you're trying to sell and how do you want to and how do you want to play. So the truth will depend on what you're selling. It won't really say that there is one size that'll fit all. So you've got to be willing to continuously keep evolving that. And sales organizations will keep evolving as you will keep evolving your strategy, right? And I keep telling people, I said, first figure out what you're trying to do in the market and then staff for it, right? Because a lot of times what we get guilty of is first staffing for it and then saying, I think there is nothing worse than that. And I think one of the reasons why you're seeing this whole spate of layoffs that are happening, right? And everybody, every CEO standing up and saying, "Me culpa, me culpa," is because they're all saying, "I overhired." What does that mean? That means that I first said I'll bring the body in, and I'll then figure out what the body will do, right? Instead of saying, this is a problem that I'm seeing in the market, and I need somebody to solve for it, and therefore I'm going to bring somebody in. Right? Because the moment you do it from an outside in standpoint, then you're in a place which is a real problem that you're trying to solve for. So I think that will continue to happen, and that will continue for you to and because sales is always on the front line of things, you will continuously need to keep evolving that organization, keep evolving your reward mechanism. I remember. I was talking to somebody from Microsoft recently, and they were like, you know what, great incentive program, but I'm not sure I understand all of it, right? Because a lot of people, complicate the heck out of it so much that people, you'll get.
Why is that though?
Because especially in tech, right? What I've realized is that you have a lot of people with so much intellectual horsepower that they keep putting it into different places and complicating the heck out of everything. So, but yeah, I mean, incentive programs. Suddenly, I mean, I'm seeing organizations have such crazy ones, and I mean, if you really go to the base of it, right? Incentives are meant to drive behavior, right? And if you stay with that as your core design principle, that it's supposed to drive behavior, right? Then you've got to start modeling the behavior that you want and say, okay, if this is the behavior that I want, right, how will I reward it, and what will I reward, right? And that is all the clarity that you need. Everything else is just, you're just putting lipstick on a pig.
Fair enough. In terms of, let's say, just like selling, I guess, like, are there like any cultural plays that kick in? I feel like a lot of times it's happened, like you go into say like, and you get a sense, hey, these guys are really convinced. And they said, yes, Sujit, we want your product, let's chat. And then they ghost you, or then there's like just you don't get the same kind of behavior as what they were saying. Right? And I feel like we are a very yes no culture in India, right? So um, do you see any cultural nuances that are specific to our country versus, let's say, Europe and the US, and then how you have specifically combated that or solved that?
So I think in my experience, there are nuances that come in. There's regional nuances, there's organizational nuances, cultural nuances that kick in. Um, some of it can be useful for your sale. Some of it can be detrimental. Um, and it, uh, but the language of business to a large extent remains consistent, right? So they got to be able to see value. They got to be able to have the need, either a, a problem to solve or an opportunity to harness, right? So that language remains the same, but how you get to it, how you go about it, can be influenced by regional nuances and cultural nuances. For example, in India, if you're selling in certain states, and if the composition of most of the customers or the buyers are very, language driven, colloquial, it helps if you can speak that language. And if you can, relate it with the buyer at a different level. But, does that mean only if you do that are you successful? No. Will it accelerate things? Maybe. But you got to be aware of it nonetheless, right? And in India, I think, actually not just India, I think anywhere in the world today, your sale isn't even done when the PO is released. Your sale is done when you got paid for it.
Paid, yeah.
Right? Until then, it's wrong to assume that your sale is done. There are instances where people have been paid incentive, and then down the line the client reneged. They didn't get make the full payment, etc. And there's been clawback of incentives and all of that. So I think that's another thing salespeople need to kind of build into themselves. It doesn't end with picking up the PO and coming. It's a long game, right? And there are instances I've witnessed myself where written contracts meant nothing, right? The client still went ahead and did not go through with what they said they did. And I think that's where the nuances come. In my experience, a lot of the buyers outside of India follow a very defined methodology, right? They will say, listen, we are evaluating, this is the period for evaluation, and then we're going to have internal assessment, we're going to score people, and then we're going to let you know where you stand, and then we're going to shortlist people. So they actually tell you that's what you're going to do. Time frames are defined. You know what you got to do, and it's very organized. Now these may shift, right? They might say it's going to happen in 2 weeks. It might happen after 4 weeks, but the process that they follow is still the same. But that doesn't mean that they always follow the process for the decision making. In the end, somebody could, even outside of India, somebody could come in and, from a board level, they'll get a thing saying that,
Yeah.
you got to thanks for the evaluation, but
Right.
we're buying the other stuff. So that still happens. I think in India, getting that kind of clarity as to how the sales process will progress is a little harder. There are many companies that have it. There are many companies that are very consistent in how they buy, but there are many that are not. So you got to be able to adapt your style and figure out how you want to do it based on that. Um, yeah, that's been my personal experience at least.
Has
And
getting paid
go ahead.
been a frequent challenge across the board, or do you feel that's in your line of sales few and far between just because of the size of company you're dealing with?
No, actually, it is there. I would say that there is a certain percentage of that risk for any size of companies. In fact, sometimes if you're bigger, then the customer thinks that it's not even going to hurt you. So, hey, what the hell, let's do it. They might actually pay out the smaller guy, so to speak, right? So you're actually at a bigger risk of not getting it. Um, I think that there are a couple of things. One is there are habitual, uh, you know,
Offenders.
defaulters, right? And you should be able to do a little bit of homework and figure that pattern out. And that so, for example, in my company, if I want to sell to somebody, it actually goes through a vetting process. Somebody is evaluating to say, do we want to sell to that client, or is that client going to be, good for us, etc. Right now, obviously, you may not have the luxury of doing that or the scale to be able to do that for a lot of smaller organizations. But nonetheless, I think the salesperson must bake that into their psyche, saying that, hey, let me do some research, right? And then you've got to figure out if this customer is going to be a high risk customer from a payment perspective or not. Then there are external factors which you can't control, right? Um, and that could be natural, occurrences, natural disasters, markets crashing, a whole bunch of other things because of which you might not receive your payment or it gets delayed or whatever. So, I mean, those are there. Those may not be applicable only to you. It could be to everybody else dealing with that customer as well. But those are easier to kind of get past. But yeah, certainly, I think there is maybe a higher percentage than it should be in terms of risk not getting paid.
So, to add to what Sujit just said, I think in India, one thing is always a given, right? That payments, you'll always have a cash flow issue.
Right.
And especially if you're a startup, right? You'll always be at the mercy of somebody or the other who's holding off your payment because he's not got some receivable and he wants to make good something else, right? And it's a balancing that everybody's doing at any given point in time, right? I was reading somewhere the other day about DMart, right? And apparently what DMart does very well is that they pay all their suppliers within a week.
Wow.
And what that does for them is that they all the suppliers give them the first right of refusal and the best quality of supplies, right?
Who thought that would be a differentiator, no? We're getting paid on time.
Exactly. No, and that's the whole point, right? That if you're able to understand what is the pain of the customer, right? And here, DMart said, my customer wants the lowest price, best quality, and the supplier was willing to drop down pricing as long as he gets the money, right? It just became a win-win, and they started creating this massive flywheel for themselves, which enabled them to actually become way more profitable because the quality of this, all of that, right? But I have seen so many, and I speak to multiple founders, right? Majority of them are like, you know what, I haven't been paid on this, and I haven't paid this vendor this, right? And you're guilty on both sides, right? You're not received and you haven't paid, right? Because you're like, if he doesn't pay me, there's no way I can pay that. And everybody's perpetually rationalizing this, right? And so in some senses, this whole payment piece is a big issue, especially if you're a startup, right? So you've got to figure out, how do you ensure that you get paid and you get paid quickly, and what do you do, right? Because if you're a startup, cash is oxygen,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely.
And if anywhere you get starved of that oxygen, right, that's the death knell. So you've got to ensure that, how do you ensure, what do you need to do, right? If you discount, what does that mean? If you get early payment, what does that mean? How do you and I think a lot of times founders miss the trick about how do I think from cash flow, and how do I start deploying cash flow to actually start turning the wheels for me in different ways, right? Because cash in book means nothing
Yeah.
like cash in hand.
Yeah, and I've come across a large customer who had a program in place saying that, we'll ensure that you get paid, let's just say, for example, 60 days from the come what may, but you got to give us an upfront discount of 2 or 3%. And when you actually, if you have lots of transactions with that customer and you're looking at the cost of money or the delay of you not getting, it might be better off for you to give that discount and sign up
Yep.
that program, right? So, a lot of stuff like this happens, and it can be either a useful tool for you, or it could be a death knell, depending on what situation it is. But it is a very big factor.
And that's why your salesperson needs to really start being able to think like a business person, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of time the enterprise sellers will have to be more business oriented than any other salesperson, right? So they will have to think not just about at what margin are they going to get on this deal, but when is the money going to come in? What does delayed cash coming in mean to the margin of that particular deal? The whole economics of it, right? The person's got to have the understanding to actually be able to do this, right? And if those are important metrics for you, then your reward mechanism for the seller should ensure that they are demonstrating those behaviors and being aware of those challenges, right? And to me, that becomes a great sales incentive to ensure that you model the behaviors that you're looking for.
With this payment thing you're talking about, it's super pervasive. I was talking to one of the partners at a law firm, and I was telling her that, listen, we're having issues where we haven't gotten paid on time, and she's like, we as a law firm have issues where we are not getting paid on time. I mean, I wish there was a better solution to all of this. Like, I feel like in the US, you see these shows, right? Like people who are not the police, but they wear like all this artillery and like they ask for money, right? Because like if you socially shit on them, that's not going to work, right? You can
I think
beg.
you should have a publicly available credit score, just like what your payable is at any given point. You just like that's what.
Yeah.
No, but honestly, I mean, this is the reality, right? I mean, the reality is that everybody's struggling to figure out how to get the cash flow right and in order, right? You've got you're starting to see a lot more complex financial instruments that are coming in, right? So you've got things like bill discounting, right? So you've got an invoice that you've raised, right? You can actually go to bill discounting companies or banks that are willing to take an invoice from a company and discount it and give you cash upfront, right? So there are multiple people who are doing those different things, right? But as a seller, those are not your domain, right? Your domain is to ensure that you get the money out from your customer at the time frame that you've agreed in, right? But as a founder, you've got to figure out, is that bill that you've generated, is that discountable? Is there an opportunity for you to actually get cash upfront, right? But cash flow and how do you solve for it? I think in a lot of ways, that's really the crux of the business, right? So how do you actually make that piece hum is where the secret sauce lies.
I feel like we spent quite a bit of time, so maybe we can wrap this up with the last few questions. And Ajay, I know you've been sick, so we should definitely keep this under 5-10 minutes. I mean, you guys have been doing this for 20 years. What any crazy stories that you want to share? Whether that's which you won't get debarred from your companies to share, but anything that's from the past or from today.
Well, so crazy stories. All I can say is that when we used to work for larger organizations, we used to have annual sales conferences. Those were fun. Lots of learning. A lot of stuff that happens, which um,
we don't speak about.
which we don't speak about. But I think it goes a long way in building the camaraderie. So I'll tell you, the first time that I went for one of these global sales conferences, right, at Microsoft. Up until then, I think I went for that maybe a year into the organization. And my whole perspective, my motivation levels, my commitment to the organization completely changed. Because suddenly I'm sitting in the stadium with 12,000 people from 150 countries. Up until then, for that 1 year, I thought I'm working for Microsoft in India. There were 200 people in the company. And then suddenly you get to see the scale. 150 countries, 12,000 people, different languages, all of them doing something similar to what I'm doing, right? And that's when you start realizing what the scale of the company is and, where you're working and all of that. Now, that case is a big one. The same thing applies even if you're like a 50-member organization, and especially in today's context where everybody's hybrid working and working from home. I think it has the same effect. If you brought 50 people into a bar and got together, I think it to the mind it has the same effect, right? So I think that's something that's very intrinsic to the sales function as well. The ability to interact with people, because there's a very high percentage of physical interaction and people interaction and all of that, which is part of the whole sales process. So you should do stuff that encourages that and that helps harness that as well. Now there are stories that go really, really wrong, but I think one of the ones that I can tell you is, so we had a global accounts meet once at Vancouver, and I had like 3 very, very senior customer executives who were part of that. And, we just got around to planning and we ended up doing a road trip together, right? But the entire relationship, the whole equation between us changed after that, right? And now we're friends. We're friends at a very, very different level. So I think things, and it was great. And it was not like in that 3-hour drive between Seattle and Vancouver, I was like selling to them or anything, right? We were just like, people get to know, but then you start relating at a different level. And I think that, and then paid off for me in the long run, in the subsequent years when I had to deal with them professionally as well, right? So I think you got to kind of keep your eye out for opportunities like that, and but then also make sure that you're not squandering it away or messing it up by doing the wrong things.
Right.
There are people that you can do the wrong things. Ajay is definitely one of them. You should doing the wrong thing. But then what is right and wrong, right, Ajay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Actually, quick question, and maybe Sujit, I spoke to you about this a little yesterday while you were like, hey, let's do a dry run. But this whole Chat GPT 3 thing, which is kicked in. I mean, at least for us, from a marketing standpoint, it's almost acting like a marketing associate, right? It's helping you write copy, it's helping you write content, it can help you templatize on the email side of things, write to ads and performance, right? So like I see the use cases very clearly, at least in the space that we operate in. How is that, let's say, has that even trickled into the sales play at all, at an EY level or at an Adobe level? Like, are people talking about it? If you are, how you think you're implementing it within the company? What's been the conversation around that?
So, I mean, see, AI and ML is something that all organizations have been trying to figure out, right? And lots of organizations are doing a whole bunch of stuff around it. Especially from an Adobe standpoint, we've had a big play that we did with AI and ML called Sensei that's built into our products, right? And right now our products, especially if we take Photoshop and stuff like that, right? And you want to actually, say, change background. Early on, you needed a bunch of skills to actually be able to do it. Today, you can type it and it can change the mood of the picture, etc., etc. Right? So there's a lot of enhancements that we've been doing in our set of products, right? Now, when I overlay what Chat GPT, etc., is doing and trying to make it that much more simpler and more commonplace with regard to answering a whole bunch of different questions, right? I mean, to me, it's the way I think about it in my head, that it's a much more refined outcome of what 3 or 4 Google searches would do, and it comes and gives it to me at one single go, right? And it starts to
Right.
collate it and put it together and makes it much more easier and palatable for me to do, right? And the fact is, today, I mean, if you go back 20 years, right, information was hard to come by. Information almost was power, right? uh, in a lot of ways, Google started to put information out there for all of us to actually be able to do this. And Chat GPT, to my mind, is going to structure that in a lot more concise manner for us to actually act on it, right? So I think that's going to be the evolution. And I was watching some interview with Sam Altman where he was saying that, the way people had envisaged AI and ML was that it'll go blue collar, low
Right.
low
Yeah,
earning,
Right.
white,
yeah.
etc., and then eventually the creatives. And he says what we are seeing with Chat GPT-3 is that it's actually going to go creatives first and then backwards from there, right? So you don't know, right? And but
Right.
but 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 my point is that, uh, you can view these as existential threats, or you can view these as aids to your
It's,
to your being, right? And how you view it and how you then utilize it is really what's gonna make anything out of it, right? And I think there are enough uh, salespeople who are using it for their advantage. There are enough salespeople who are looking the other way, thinking that, this is not something that's ever going to happen, right? So, and it takes all kinds to make this work. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I just think that it is something that's here and it's real. But how profound the impact is going to be, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting space to watch for.
Start
So
by
I should
confessing that I really don't know too much about this topic to, share much around it. I do know that there's a lot of WhatsApp groups that are exchanging articles say that it's the best thing since sliced bread and it's going to change the world. And then there are articles that people who are saying that, uh, dumb things are happening and, it's not going to work, etc. So I think right now everybody's in that phase, right? But I do know that it will make a difference going forward. How much of it and how do you adapt around it is something to be seen. It actually reminds me of a situation that I experienced at some point in my career earlier. This whole concept of reverse auction came into play, right? Where customers said that, hey, if I'm going to be buying a standard product, a standard offering, I know exactly what I want. I know who are the people who can give it. There is not much difference in what, A versus B versus C, right? So they started this concept of reverse auction. And it's pretty no-brainer, right? Put it out there, lowest price gets it. But guess what? It's still not the preferred way of buying for most customers. So while it was simple, while it was a no-brainer, it was good for both parties because you're not putting in much in terms of effort to sale. You're just, looking at pricing, customers just calling in for lower and lower and lower pricing. It's almost like a reverse bidding, right? In the bidding process. But you see, it still did not become de facto method of buying products or services, even for the ones that are consistent. So I think the parallel I'm trying to draw is it remains to be seen where this goes. It may not necessarily be doomsday situation which is going to replace everybody. You don't need sellers, you don't need marketers. I don't think that's the situation. I think as long as we humans stay on top of the food chain, I think it's still there is hope for us. Now, if this changes the food chain order, then then maybe we should call for another podcast to figure that out. For now, let's see.
Perfect.
Sweet.
Then you won't get invited for the
Amitabh
next
will be here with us.
podcast.
And it wouldn't matter if Ajay is sick or not. We'll always have healthy Ajay. Nice. Awesome, guys. I guess that's. I feel at least we've gotten a lot of.
Yeah. Thanks so much. This was super, super helpful, insightful.
Yeah, and I feel like there were a lot of these metaphors and references. I feel like that itself could become like a 10, 15 reel play. So thank you for that. Anything else, Ajay, before we wind up?
No, I think we're good. This was, again, like Ani said, super useful. I think anyone who listens to this can draw a lot of insights. And yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Awesome.